This is The Ridge on Air.
Welcome to this episode of The Ridge on Air. I'm your host, Boo Prince, and coming up on the show today, we're going to be asking the question, how does our current education system not serve us, and in what way can it be transformed to better equip our children for this increasingly uncertain and complex world that we are going to be sending them out into in a few years' time? We're joined by Neil Butcher, who's an education specialist. He's going to share some of his views and some new ideas. And we've also invited our own headmaster, Richard Stanley, to respond and share some of his thoughts on the subject. Now, education's obviously a meaty topic, and our show today really only briefly touches on some of those issues, but we trust it'll give you a lot of food for thought and perhaps act as a catalyst for deeper conversations in your own home about what we want from education. We've also got sport news, we've got leadership projects, and we've even got music from two reggae jamming lads, Thabo Mngomezulu and Bonolo Ndumela, who perform a cracking tune from Stevie Wonder. All this coming up.
You're listening to The Ridge on Air.
Well, as promised, we are going to be speaking to Neil Butcher on the show today. Now, Neil is an education specialist. He's worked with educational governments and institutions around the world for the last 25 years. He's also a Ridge old boy and still currently a Ridge parent until the end of this year. And but in fact, both your boys have been through the Ridge, Neil.
That's correct.
And your oldest son is now at St. Albans, I believe.
Yes.
So Neil has some very strong ideas about what education should be and the brief opportunity that we have right now to rethink what education should look like and the problem that we're actually solving for. So Neil, welcome to the podcast. It's lovely to have you with us. And I'm hoping that over the next couple of minutes, you'll be able to share some of those ideas with us about what is the problem that we're solving for? What should education be? And what are we currently dealing with that is not serving us?
Well, I think there's two different aspects to that question. I think the first is general, which I think is that we all know that the economies and societies of the world have transformed beyond recognition, but our education systems are looking pretty much the same as they did 100, 200 years ago. And so I think there the problem is that the kind of education that our children are going through is not really preparing them for the challenges of the modern world or preparing them for integration into the workplace and so on. So that's the one side. But I think then particularly for a school like the Ridge, which is, if we're honest about it, an elite school targeting the children of society's leaders who in turn will become leaders in their own right in future. I think we see around the world that we are suffering from a deficit of high quality leadership, not only in government, but also across all social institutions. And I think the other key requirement of education at the moment for that type of institution is actually to be much more purposeful about producing the kind of ethical leaders of integrity that the world is going to need as we navigate the challenges that I mentioned in the first challenge. And I think that the reality is that the vast majority of time that our kids spend at school is not actually purposefully preparing them for either of those two realities.
So Neil, one of the things that I find really interesting is, first of all, our perceptions about what makes a good leader have changed a lot, I think, in the last 100 years as well. If you think back to a sort of a colonial style world, leadership was very much about kind of divide and dominate people underneath you. Whereas these days we understand that leadership takes a lot of different forms. How do we teach leadership? How do we solve for what a good leader is?
I don't think the definitions are that difficult. The more important question is what kind of educational activities could our children be engaging in that are most likely to produce ethical leaders for the future, people who understand, particularly of importance for me, is that the role of those in positions of power and authority is a role of service and service to those who don't have the power and authority, rather than a role of dominance and exploitation. Obviously, that's somewhat idealistic, but I don't know that there's a lot of parents at the Ridge who would disagree with the importance of inculcating those kinds of cultures and values into our children. So for me, the critical question really is, if we have the children on campus, say from 8 until 3 or 4 p.m. every day, how can we best use the time and that critical interaction between the teachers and the students to inculcate the kinds of values that we would like to see in the leadership of the future? And that's where I would be focusing the attention.
So how do we spend that time? I mean, one of the things that I hear so often people say is, yes, well, our children are getting educated for roles that haven't even been invented yet. And that's precisely the point, isn't it? Is that we don't know what the future looks like. So how are we teaching them, or what are we teaching them in those hours that we have the children during the day at school? What are we teaching them that is of value to them for an unexpected future?
I think you're quite correct that we can't predict the future, and I think that's obviously getting harder. Job turnover, the kinds of jobs that are important are changing so fast because of the digital economy. The complexity of the world seems to be increasing, whether it is or not, in terms of political relationships and all sorts of other kinds of dimensions. So I would say that under those circumstances, the only thing you can do is do the basics well. Is to focus on the kind of core skills and competences and values that we know transcend time and that will be valuable and will help people to manage the unknown and to manage uncertainty and to leverage uncertainty as an opportunity, not to see it as a risk. So I would be much more inclined to focus strongly on creating that grounding in our children. I think if we look at what happens in schools, this is not about the Ridge, it's about all schools. The truth is that we spend the vast majority of our time regimenting the children into a timetabled curriculum where they're moved around from one subject to the next in 45-minute or 40-minute blocks or whatever it is, focusing on subjects that are still very dominantly oriented towards learning content. And as the knowledge economy has exploded, it's a progressively small amount of the content of the world. So that's where they're spending most of their mornings. And then they're spending most of their afternoons doing team sports. And team sports are great, but again, I think they're not that great at developing many of the kind of key skills that our children will need in future, because they tend to focus on competition, they tend to focus on the value of the individual and individual excellence, and they tend to focus on the importance of winning. They also tend to orient the school and its resources towards the most talented children, who end up getting the best coaching, the best access to facilities. Again, that's not a problem from my perspective per se, but I don't think that we could argue that that's necessarily the optimal use of resources to help to build the kinds of generic skills and competences that will prepare our children to manage that future uncertain world with confidence.
So the kind of skills that we should be looking towards then are things like maybe a comfort with complexity and being able and confident to move through spaces which are uncertain and unclear, and have the confidence to deal with things which are not concrete. Emotional resilience, for instance.
I think there's a long list of skills. I think there'd be some debate and disagreement and argument about which are the most important. I think the sad thing is more how regularly we're just turning over the decisions to continue with what's been happening for the last 50, 75 years without even having a discussion about what's most important to learn and what's most important to know. So I think all the things you've said are really important. I think in addition to that, learning how to solve problems, learning independence. I think in some respects, the coronavirus has been a little bit of a blessing because it's taught a lot of our boys about the need to be independent and self-motivated that they just don't have to learn at school because they're being shunted around from one classroom and one subject to the next and having a teacher always on tap to tell them what to do. So even though they've struggled with this period in many instances, as have the parents, I still think the skills they've learned are going to stand them in really good stead in 10 or 15 years' time. Other things that are important to me is, for example, to understand the link between physical health and well-being and emotional and mental health and well-being, and to see how those things are interconnected. At the moment, we place very heavy emphasis on the intellectual side of humanity and not on the other dimensions of the emotional well-being, as you say, emotional resilience, the physical well-being, and understanding how all those things are interconnected. So there's lots of different kinds of things I think we could be focusing on that are not taught in the core curriculum.
This is the Rich on Air.
Well, this is a discussion which clearly gives all of us a great deal of food for thought, and we're going to continue speaking to Neil Butcher in just a few moments, right after we hear a little more about Grade 7 leadership projects and catch up with some of our local musicians. Stay with us.
Leadership at the Ridge.
It's time to dust off your running shoes and get into shape for summer. Join me, Matt Thomas, for my Grade 7 leadership project as we take on the Ridge Cross Country training route for the Jacaranda Run Challenge. Every Tuesday morning through October, I'll be hosting training runs through our beautiful Westcliff suburb as we prepare for the live events when each senior prep boy will compete for the best run time. For more information, please look on the Ridge School app under the Grade 7 Leadership Program. See you there.
Email us at onair@ridgeschool.co.za.
Whether you need an early morning kickstart or an afternoon pick-me-up, the Snazzy Max has got you covered. Pick up a delicious creamy cappuccino, a cool fruit smoothie, or even just a refreshing cup of tea. The Snazzy Max is now conveniently located in a trailer outside the main school gates on Wilson Road. The Snazzy Max at the Ridge, where the coffee is tops and the smiles are free.
Well, if you recognize that tune, you're not alone. It's an absolute classic. It's called Master Blaster and was written by Stevie Wonder as an ode to Bob Marley. And so beautifully, beautifully performed by our incredibly skilled Ridge lads, musicians Thabo Ngomazulu and Bonolo Ndumela.
Music at the Ridge.
Okay, well, we're going to be returning to the second part of our conversation with Neil Butcher in just a second. Straight after that, we've got sport coming up, and then we go to Headmaster Mr. Richard Stanley's office for a chat on his thoughts on the future of education. Neil, we've got this kind of amazing and bizarre opportunity which has been thrust upon us through lockdown and COVID and everything that's happened around the world. How do we most effectively embrace the opportunity to think about how we do it differently?
I think the two most important questions would be, number one, what is it that we ought to be focusing on as a priority that we are not currently prioritizing in the education of our children? And I think that has to be a discussion between the parents and the teachers and the leadership of the schools. I don't think it can be left to the schools to decide, because parents exert tremendous pressure on schools not to transform. And then secondly, from there, how can we best use the time that's available to us and the resources at our disposal? And our main resource always is going to be our teachers. How can we free up their time and their headspace to help to design the kinds of educational environments that will allow our children to learn the things that we think are important, rather than just continuing to push them through this cookie-cutter piping system of formal curriculum that's teaching them a whole lot of things that they're never going to use again in their lives.
So really that becomes around, how do we kind of collaborate with our teachers? How do we support our teachers? Because how can we expect our teachers to do things differently when they are also sitting with this legacy of how they have been trained and sort of ingrained to teach things in a certain way and to look for certain outcomes and so on. So it's what we're actually talking about is kind of a redesign of our entire philosophy and idea of what education should look like. And that's a pretty big ask.
It is a big ask, but on the other hand, it's the future of our children that's at stake. So we should be prepared to take difficult decisions in order to prepare our children as best as possible for that future and to ensure that the societies that they go into can get better than the ones that we have at the moment. And so, what I would say then that's related to all of this, that I think we as parents, because you and I are parents of the Ridge School, really need to ask ourselves. And the coronavirus has given us this unprecedented opportunity, which is to say, what are we willing to let go of in order to make that possible? Because what we've seen in coronavirus is people clinging on to old ways of doing things, old habits, and actually getting terrified by the fact that this new normal is making those habits impossible to implement. But the reality is that the vast majority of the things that we cling on to don't actually serve us very well. And I think that can be seen nowhere better than in education. We cling on to models of education or models of schooling because that's what we knew, not because it's what will serve our children best. And we've got this great moment where we've been disrupted to such a significant extent because of the social disruptions caused by the pandemic. That's the moment that we should grasp with both hands to see what can we let go of, what can we stop clinging to, and how can we make sure that we channel that in such a way that it actually creates education environments that prepare our children for the world they're going into.
So Neil, another thing which is really interesting and important to address is many people around us keep pointing to technology and saying, school's going to go online and technology is the answer, and we need to embrace what technology can bring to education. What is your view on the role of technology in trying to recreate this new idea of education?
The vast majority of technology use in education systems today is just driven by the marketing imperative of the technology companies that are selling the technology to the schools. And I think it has very limited educational value. The reality is that technology can only be effective when it's underpinned by a very strong understanding of how to do education well. So if you integrate technology into education systems that are poorly designed and poorly implemented, all the technology will do is magnify that poor pedagogy. So the starting point for me should never be about the technology. It should always be about our educational objectives and the kinds of activities we want to engage our students in. And definitely for a primary school like the Ridge, that should focus first and foremost on the relationship between the teachers and the students, because that's where all the educational value lies. That's what I'm paying for in the expensive private school fees that I'm paying at the Ridge. And if that was not what was available, I would stop paying those fees. Then if we have that right, there's lots of ways in which technology can augment that. And we've seen, again, from the coronavirus, that technology can be used effectively to support different modes of learning. And that it can allow us to accelerate our way through the curriculum, for example, to free up the time between teachers and students to do different things. But it can't be done. It can't do that if all we're doing is using technology to replicate face-to-face classrooms. So I think really the key is to get the educational design right first. And then once you've done that, actually the use of technology almost solves itself as a problem. We're not trying to run away from technology. It's pervasive in our lives. So the idea that we would design education systems without integrated use of technology is a kind of laughable throwback to a time that no longer exists. But the key point for me is that if you start with the technology in your design, you're on a hiding to nothing. You're going to end up with very poor quality educational outcomes. So the key has got to be to start with your educational objectives and where we want to be by the end of that learning journey with our children.
Neil, my final question, what will success look like? A couple of years down the line, let's say we have taken some steps towards, changing these things and rethinking what education should look like. How will we know if we're moving in the right direction?
Unfortunately, I think the answer to that question depends on which level you're asking it, because I think there's a systemic level and then there's the level of the individual school. At the systemic level, what I really hope is that we can massively reduce our fixation on the formal curriculum. If we look, for example, at disadvantaged schools, the fact that they are expected to push students through the same kind of highly structured curriculum with many teacher specialists in different subjects is doing those children a real disservice. If we could instead narrow the core of the focus of the curriculum up to grade 12 on fewer subjects with much more emphasis on the kinds of core competences that I was talking about, that would enable them to get much greater success. At the level of the Ridge, what I really hope is in tackling the problem from the bottom up, even if the curriculum stays the same, how can we harness all the affordances that we have at our disposal, high quality teachers, the availability of online technologies, stable home environments, etc., to really free up the time of the timetable so that instead of the children spending 5 to 6 hours a day in subject-based classes, we can rather give them much more opportunity to do exploring, to be engaging in project-based work, to be developing skills in teamwork. There's no end to the kind of creative environments that we can design if we just give the teachers the space and the opportunity to design those. But once they are in this hamster mill of ongoing testing and so many subjects that have to be taught and so many milestones that have to be reached at the end of every single term, in exactly the same way that a business can't really thrive in profitability if it's focused on its quarterly results, a school can't really thrive in terms of developing future leaders if it's always fixated on and focused on the grades of its students. And again, I would emphasize the fault there lies predominantly not with the school and with the teachers. It lies with us as the parents, because we're bringing those values and expectations into our relationship with the school. So we have to shift first, and if we shift, the school will follow with us.
There you have it. Neil Butcher, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a very enlightening and engaging conversation. And I think there's a lot of food for thought in there, a lot of opportunity for us to engage both as parents and teachers and generally throughout the world to rethink what it is that we are actually educating our children for and the world that lies ahead of them and how they will ultimately make it. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Great pleasure. It'd be nice to talk to you.
Thank you.
Comes off the bench to score his 15th of the season.
The Ridge on Air Sport.
Well, it's definitely not an afternoon for sport here at the Ridge. I'm sure you can hear it is absolutely pelting down. The heavens have opened and it is just crazy outside. And two young men who have braved the elements throughout lockdown and been making the Ridge School incredibly proud with their sporting achievements are Faizan Adroos and Michael van Heerden. And we're going to be talking to them and finding out exactly what they have been doing during this period. Welcome, Faizan. And please tell us about all the climbing you've been doing even during lockdown.
Hi, thanks for having me. So throughout the period of COVID-19 and lockdown, us as climbers and a few of my comrades from my climbing team at the Ridge have been invited by the City Rock Johannesburg climbing team to beta test for them, where they can test the rules and restrictions of COVID-19 to prevent infections spreading. And a few of my comrades and I have been able to, even throughout this period of COVID-19, improve the levels at which we climb and our technique, despite having only gone at least once a week, and we're trying to improve that. In comparison to when we were at school climbing 3 times a week. So it's been truly amazing, as well as we've improved our climbing to the point at which we started new disciplines and have been invited on new journeys outdoors. So I really think that all climbers and myself have fought against COVID and doing as best we can.
Well done. I think that's absolutely fantastic. And thank you for sharing your story with us. This weather is crazy. I'm so glad you're not on a mountainside today.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for having me.
Take care.
You too.
Okay, so we're going to speak to Michael van Heerden. Now, Michael is an incredibly keen swimmer. And Michael, I understand that you swam right the way through the winter. And in exactly the same way that they say summer bodies are made in winter, I believe that summer swimming times are made in winter too.
Yes, so I've been swimming for a few months now during the start of lockdown. And I've been training very hard. My times have improved quite a lot because they held a EGA Gala at St. Benedict's, which stands for Eastern Gauteng Aquatics, and I've gotten my South African National Junior Champs times, and those are usually held at the start of the year.
Congratulations, that's really fantastic. And I believe that you also achieved some personal best times.
Yes, I did.
Absolutely fantastic. Well, keep up the good work and we'll see you in the pool.
Yes, thank you.
The Ridge on Air.
Well, I'm delighted today to finally have managed to coax our dear headmaster, Mr. Richard Stanley, onto the podcast. Richard, it's so wonderful to have you on the podcast today. And such an interesting topic of conversation. We've heard from Neil Butcher, who's an education specialist. And of course, you're an education specialist, having been in the game for more years than perhaps you would care to share with us. But I'm delighted to hear your views on some of the issues that Neil raised, because I think they are so important. And perhaps you can also give us some insights into the kind of practical nature of some of those ideas at a school level rather than a policy level. So first of all, welcome.
Thank you. Lovely to be here. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
And Richard, why don't we start with the subject of curriculum? Neil spoke so much about the need in a modern education system to kind of reduce the amount of content that we are teaching children and focus instead on some of the more skills-based ideas, leadership, empathy, problem solving. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you. Well, it is lovely to be with you. I listened very carefully to what Neil had to say, and to the greatest extent, I actually agree with him. I think there's a lot that we are learning, have learnt in recent years, and are learning about curriculum and what's right to do in terms of preparing children for a lifetime of not only work, but a lifetime of giving themselves into the environment that they'll find themselves in the years to come. And so in that context, I think we have been led to a place where we recognize that curriculum is far more than simply what they get in the classroom, formally and intentionally given by a teacher in the old-fashioned version of what children used to be taught. I think there's still a place for that. There's no question that in a primary school context, and we're a primary school, there is a place for that. And for the old-fashioned 3 R's, if you want, reading, writing, and arithmetic. But it's deeper than that now, because I think there are a number of other R's that play into it. There's relationship, there's relevance, there is resilience and resourcefulness, there's responsibility, there are rights. So there are a number of other R's that play into it and that we have to consider, and it's worth considering it early on. I mean, primary school is all about foundation laying, and curriculum essentially is focused on the bricks that you put into place to bring out those foundations, and in a way that's going to allow the child to become a young adult who will then become a leader in some area that's going to be solidly positioned, that person solidly positioned for the years to come. And my sense of where we have got it wrong in years gone by is that we focus far too much on the intellect and not enough on the character, the development of the character, and the development of the child within that.
Right.
And I think we sometimes lose focus on that, and we play to other people's games or to their expectations. And by what I mean by that is that conventional thinking is often determined by what the market has to say and what market expectation is, and that comes through in the form of the parents, their conditioning, their expectation, their demand. And so schools get wrapped up in that and can't release themselves from what is sometimes a trap. Likewise, we also get wrapped up in what the expectations are beyond prep school, in the form of the senior schools and the universities. And the senior schools dictate a lot to what happens, I believe, in the primary school context. And all too often, I think, because obviously parents are saying, well, I'm sending a boy my boy to a school like the Ridge, you're expected to prepare him for a senior school of choice. and that senior school is demanding X, Y, and Z. Therefore, we're expecting you to deliver. And I think in that context, the curriculum becomes very constrained, very limiting, and very directed towards academics and academics only, or has been in the past. And I'm excited that we're at a place where it's almost a crossroads place. And Neil said it as much, just in different words, that we are at a place where we have to reconsider what it is that we are doing for our boys, with our boys, to release them into a place where they can feel more independent, to take some of that learning on themselves. But we can only really do that, and again, we're talking primary school, we can only really do that when we believe that we are holding them in a way that is going to allow the social and emotional development to come through the way that it will, in order to be able to release their characters as young men who recognize within themselves who they are, what they've got to offer, developing of confidence, developing of a self-esteem, and developing of a self-worth that position them as individuals to take on what the world is going to offer them later on to senior school and beyond.
Now, Richard, you're talking about something really interesting, and I'm going to label it as a hidden curriculum, right? Because we're not just talking about the content of what kids learn in class, but we're also talking about the kind of social and emotional and values-based environment of the school. And I guess the question that I ask is, what is the role and responsibility of us as parents in order, in the sense of being able to release you guys from our expectation and our legacy of our own education, to allow you the space to do what needs to be done to transform education so that our kids can develop those kind of skills and there's less pressure on the content-based education?
Great question. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that where we sit right now in education is at a place where far more than ever before, far more, that schools and home need to be working off the same page, and in fact more than that, need to be holding hands. And I've said that as much to the parents on occasions here at the Ridge, is that we need to recognize that if the child is going to be released into a place where he feels that he's getting not only the right messages, but that he has got the right to move into his own space at his own pace, that he's got mum and dad on the one hand, he's got his teacher on the other, and they are there to support him, and they're talking the same language, they're sharing what is for him a comforting message, but a message of affirmation to allow him to go forward with that. And that's hugely important for that child. But it can only come if there's a level of trust. If school and parent trust each other, and it's got to be a two-way street, to the extent that that relationship, parent to home, or parent to school rather, is solid and committed and reinforced with levels of recognition of each other's space and place.
Yes.
The home is the home. School and teachers can never be a parent. Not in that context.
Lockdown taught us that, Richard.
Absolutely.
I'm not a
Absolutely.
teacher.
And likewise the other way around. No, seriously. And it's so important that there's respect, there's a recognition of each other's place, and there's a holding together in those respective spaces to release the child so that he knows, in the context of the Ridge, he knows that he has the right to move on and the right to take this on. And that to me is so much of what the hidden curriculum is all about. It's defined in ways that before have been taken for granted. Parents would normally have come in years gone by, dropped their son off and say, well, take him away, do what you need to do with him, I'm relying on you to get on with it, kind of thing. But now, because of everything that's at stake, so much more that is bearing in on the life of the parent on the one hand, the school on the other, but more particularly on the child, we have to recognize that there's a role that both have to play differently in order to be able to give the child the confidence to move on into that space and the independence to do so.
Now, you've used a very powerful word which is hugely important to me and which I feel strongly about kind of reintroducing into the lexicon of education, and that is the word relationship. And Neil brought this up as well. He said, you know, he and I were touching briefly on the idea of technology in education, and I know that there are many people out there who feel that lockdown showed them, oh, my kid can do school or education or whatever, get an education online, something which I'm completely allergic to. And Neil expressed this as well, that the reason why you come to a school like this is particularly for the relationships between the parents and the teacher, the relationships between the teacher and the children. Yep. Can you talk a little bit about that and the value that the Ridge specifically places on relationships?
Let me underline it again. The word relationship is everything
when
it comes to education, and particularly when it comes to primary school education and what we are about as a school. I believe that we live in a world now where we have lost sight of what fundamental, values-based relationships need to look like. On behalf of our children, but also on behalf of ourselves as well as adults. I think we've got lost along the way. And in order to be able to find education that's going to mean something into the future, that's going to also yield the type of young people who can go into the future confident in themselves and believing, not only in themselves, but believing in each other, we've got to have relationships developing far more at depth. And with roots going down into places of belief, real belief in what relationships can and should look like in schools like this. There's absolutely no question in my mind that when you consider that education is all about people, fundamentally about people, little people, bigger people, but it's fundamentally about people. And if the relationships that connect those people are warped, if there's a disconnect, if there's mistrust, if there's areas of uncertainty, then the little people will be the ones to miss out. They will be the ones ultimately, as they go into senior school and go beyond, who will be constrained because of a lack of deeper understanding and a lack of belief and a lack of trust in what those relationships need to look like. And so for me, it's absolutely fundamental at a school like the Ridge starts with the principle that, and not the principle in this office, but the principles out there, that relationships are absolutely key, fundamental to what we're about. And that is why, to me, it's so important that, again, at a school like the Ridge, we focus attention on looking after the interests of the individual child. Yes, we've got 22 boys in a class or thereabouts, and that's fantastic, and the staff members involved and the teachers involved will be able to look after those boys. But essentially, what we're looking at is getting to know the individual, releasing the individual, recognizing within him a uniqueness of personality, a uniqueness of potential that will allow him to grow and flourish in the years to come. Where we've got to be really careful as a society that we don't get lost in the digital world too quickly. And again, particularly in the primary school. I think digital has its place. There's no question that IT and technology will add value as time goes on, but it's adding value in terms of what's right for the child and the development of the child, and not for the sake of technology per se. And there's a difference. There's a real difference. And I know that Neil touched on that, but I feel very strongly about that going into the future. Technology is invading, potentially very negatively, into the lives of children to the extent that it's actually causing potential damage, long-term damage in the lives of children right now. And I think that's problematic for me. If we're going to use it, and we will use it, we've got to use it in a way that enhances, but it's got to be on our terms, not on technology's terms. And there's a difference. Our world, adult world, let alone children's world, our adult world has been assaulted. And more particularly now, because the children have access to the adult world through technology.
Absolutely.
We have got to be so careful. We have got to be so careful. I'm deeply concerned.
Richard, as a final question, in your view, as someone who has seen education evolve, or perhaps not evolve enough over the last several decades. What do you think is going to be the key to moving into the future, and in such a way that education serves our children better than it currently does?
Well, I think we have already touched on it. Look, we don't have a crystal ball. We have no idea what the future is bringing to us. But we've got a pretty clear understanding that we're going to be challenged like never before. And this year has been a marker preparing us for that. And so for me, the most important thing looking at the future is to prepare young people with a sense of identity, with a recognition of who they are as individuals, that they have a right to be themselves, stand on their own 2 feet, make their own shadow with confidence, knowing that they've got a role to play, and giving into that, feeding into that, a real sense of quickness about what they need to understand as that role. What is that role? How do they pick up on responsibility? How do they recognize that they can be people who will perhaps be able to make a difference in a world beyond? I think we've got trapped in a society, and here I'm talking global society, where we are all about what's in it for me, instead of recognizing, well, hold on, how can I make a difference in a world beyond, where we can focus attention on others as I focus attention on what I can give into that environment to make a difference. And to me, that's lifelong learning. And that has to start in the foundations as laid in a primary school like the Ridge.
Thank you so much for your time. I've loved talking to you. And thank you for inviting us into your office.
It's a pleasure. It's nice to have you with me.
It's wonderful to be able to set up microphones actually in your office.
It's been a real treat to have you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.
You're listening to The Ridge on Air.
That's Ridge School headmaster Richard Stanley kindly sharing some of his thoughts and feelings on the future of education and how we can best equip our young lads to take on this uncertain future that lies ahead. Well, that's almost it for this episode of The Ridge on Air. We're still going to be hearing from Matthew Thompson, yet another grade 7 who has bravely taken on the leadership challenge. Aside from that, if you would like to get hold of us here at the podcast, please do email us onair@ridgeschool.co.za. Thank you so much to all our guests and participants on the show, and special thanks to Marketing Director Joe Cotwell and our Audio Director Ted Laux for making this show possible. Until next time, cheers.
Welcome to the Climb Mount Everest Virtual Challenge. I'm Matthew Thompson, and for my Grade 7 Leadership Project, I'm climbing Mount Everest virtually. I will be climbing the West Cliff Stairs approximately 246 times to raise funds for the World Wildlife Fund. Please visit the school app for more details.
This is The Ridge on Air.
The Ridge on Air is brought to you by Prince Media, voiceover, media coaching, and podcast services. Visit princemedia.co.za for more.